It's no secret. Over the past 2 years, we have all gone through collective trauma and various forms of grief. Even if no one in your life has died, I'm willing to bet that you are dealing with grief on some level. Whether that be from loss of friends or family members, maybe you've lost your job, business, or career. Or maybe the excessive global travel restrictions have prevented you from seeing people whom you love and care the most. Today, we're going to talk about grief and trauma, and we're going to give you some tools to help you navigate some of these very complex feelings and emotions. Welcome to C60 Health Connections, where we meet with leading experts in the health and wellness space. My friend, Dr. Aimie Apigian, is with us today. She is a board-certified preventative and addiction medicine physician with a double master's in biochemistry and public health. She specializes in trauma, attachment, and helps people reverse the effects of stored emotions in the body. Having her personal experience in foster parenting, adopting, and her own chronic fatigue and autoimmune issues, she has discovered that negative life experiences become our biology, not just our psychology. Compromising every system in our biology, stored emotions can cause inflammation, digestive issues, and can contribute to various diseases and accelerated aging. Stored emotions can become the biggest thief to our health and happiness without us ever even knowing what's happening. Dr. Aimie is the founder and director of Family Challenge Camps, a weekend intensive for families, and she's also the founder of Trauma Healing Accelerated, where she provides education and courses for those wanting to hack their survival systems and accelerate their healing journey from trauma to achieve their very best mental and physical health. Now, before we get started, any statements, products, or remedies discussed today have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. Any products or topics discussed today are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent, or mitigate any disease. Aimie, it's so great to see you today. Thank you so much for joining me. I know this is such a timely and relevant topic, and you're one of the best people I can think about to kind of help us navigate through how do we deal with these really tough times we're all going through right now.
And I think that we haven't had those answers yet, right? Like, how are we navigating this? How are we managing this? Because I remember when, just talking about the pandemic, and it came out like, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And we are 2 years into that. And, one of the experiences that the body will go through that actually is a trauma is too little for too long. And, we've had too little support. We've had too little social connection. We've had too little of physical touch and hugs from our friends for too long. And even just that will compound on all of the other social changes. And it will often present itself as grief that we get stuck in, honestly, because we don't know. There's still so much that we don't know how to navigate.
It's so interesting. I mean, I think we're all really kind of at a loss about what to do. And it feels like, on a daily basis, we're just getting hit with new traumas and new surprises. And it just constantly feels like, you try to think that maybe I've got this under control, and then something happens, or, somebody that you care about gets sick. And then, maybe they're not getting the right education, information or resources. And then they're no longer here with us. This show today is the first of a series I'm actually going to do on grief. So I really appreciate you carving out some time out of your busy schedule to meet with us, because from what I can see, and I'm talking about my own self and my own life, but also observing, people in my community, people are struggling and they're having a hard time. And it's hard to process the amount of negativity and restrictions that have been, put on our lives, and also to deal with great change, whether, that be change that you appreciate or change that you really resist. So, let's dive right into this. Let's talk about a little bit about the connection between trauma and grief, because I know there's a lot here. So will you just take us through kind of like how we need to start thinking about this in order to effectively navigate?
Mm-hmm. There is a big connection between grief and trauma. And what I see is that more and more people get stuck in their grief because of pre-existing trauma patterns in their nervous system. And so when we think of grief, we know the different stages of grief, and every person has their own timeline for how they move through the different stages of grief. But what if you get stuck in that? Like, what if you actually don't see yourself moving through the normal stages of grief? Well, then something else is going on. And that something else is your nervous system. And your nervous system is designed to help you survive. It will do anything to help you survive. And one of the things that it will do is it will protect us from overwhelming emotional experiences. And so if we are going through grief and we start to feel that this emotion is too big, it's overwhelming, our nervous system will literally block that off and say, oh, we can't go there then. We can't go there. And what you'll see is usually some form of coping mechanisms that will help to then numb, distract, avoid, because our nervous system has literally decided that is too big for us to handle. And so I really want to express that this is nothing that is bad. It's not shameful. There's no judgment here for those who get stuck in the grieving process. That's happened to me. And it really is the body, the nervous system, adapting to help us survive. And these emotional experiences that can come up can be so big, so overwhelming that it would take us down. It would kind of crush us. And in order to protect us, our own nervous system stores that away, blocks that away, puts it in a box, puts it up on the shelf, back in the closet, and says, no, we cannot go there because that would be too much. And we have to be able to function. We have to be able to get up tomorrow, do what we need to do. We have to show up for our kids. We have to show up for our partner. We have to do these things. And if we let that emotion out, it would be too much. It would crush us and we couldn't do our daily work. So we're going to have to block that off. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. So let's talk about like, how do some of those coping mechanisms show up? Like you said, you can become numb, you could become distracted, you could kind of move into some kind of avoidance situation. And I think that there's times when that's appropriate because like what you just said, you have to go to work, you have to take care of your family, you need to keep showing up in spite of the fact that these things are happening. And so can you just give us a little bit of insight as to like, what do some of these mechanisms look like? How might they manifest? And what should we do about it? Like, what I'm curious about is if there is an appropriate amount of time. I know you said everyone's got their own timeline, but for these things to be okay for a while, and then at some point you go back and you try to just like, okay, I need to feel these feelings. I need to process this stuff. But we talked to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. And I feel like I need to do a brief overview of the 3 states of the nervous system to really go into that. And so we have the 3 states. One state would be the parasympathetic state. That is where we are in our best health, at our best self. Things feel manageable. Then we have the sympathetic state, which is stressed, active danger, active threat. And then we have the overwhelmed state. For those people who may know about the dorsal vagal response, Dr. Stephen Porges' work with understanding that the vagus nerve actually has this other communication system that communicates overwhelm and shuts things down. And so when we're looking at coping mechanisms, we can see which state of the nervous system am I in with these coping mechanisms. because it is entirely possible to be stressed and to keep going. It's entirely possible to be in parasympathetic and to feel what's going on and yet still be able to function. It's that overwhelm response that really is where things go into full numbing and distracting that are not necessarily going to be the best for our health, for our physiology, for our biology. And yet they may be the best that we can do at that time in our life. And so there's nothing wrong with it, but it definitely is something that we want to continue to work on, because that exactly right there, like that, Jess, is trauma pattern, is that overwhelm. And so when a person kind of looks at their overall sense of being in their body, are they intentionally or even unconsciously doing mechanisms, coping mechanisms, adaptations to completely block off feelings? Because that's clearly the overwhelmed state. Or are they able to move through and they're able to feel it, carry it almost, and not let it affect their ability to stay connected with themselves, to stay connected with other people? And so it's are you not feeling it, or are you able to feel it, keep it manageable, and move through your day with that? And so I like to bring in this word manageable, because anything that feels manageable, we're going to be able to stay in a healthy place and move through the stages of grief by keeping things manageable, by keeping the emotional experiences manageable. The sadness, the anger, right? Anger is a normal stage of that grief process. For many people, because of their prior life experiences, it is not safe for them to feel angry. And so that's what they block off. And that will not allow them to move through all the stages of grief. And yet, if we can come alongside them and teach them these tools that they can use to help keep their feeling of anger manageable, well, then they can move through that and not need to completely block it off. And so some of the coping mechanisms, I mean, there's a whole wide range of them, right? And certainly with my experience being an addiction medicine doctor, that is one form of coping mechanism of reaching for substances that will numb feelings.
Okay. So we've got people drinking more, going to the boxed wine, smoking marijuana, smoking cigarettes,
anything, right? Exactly.
Caffeine, sugar,
pain pills, right?
Pain pills, emotional eating.
Yeah. And even the anti-anxiety medications. People will find themselves reaching for those earlier and earlier. And it's not to manage panic anymore, or like the pain pills, it's not really to manage pain anymore. It's actually to help numb the emotional sensations that are coming up from the body. And when they just notice that, ooh, like I'm starting to reach for these in order to give myself this effect, that's when we know that, okay, like your body is at the place where it feels that these emotional experiences are unmanageable. And it's needing these additional, what they're using. I mean, those are tools, right? Those additional tools in order to keep things manageable. But to keep things manageable, it does mean stuffing it down. It does mean numbing it. It means, hey, it feels like an 8. That feels unmanageable. Well, if I take a pain pill, that brings it down to a 5, brings it down to a 4. That's more manageable for me. And yet it will prevent someone from moving through the stages of grief because we're numbing things in the process.
Okay. So I want to go back a couple minutes, because you mentioned, one of the things that people can kind of get stuck in is because it hasn't been safe in their life, they are avoiding anger or feelings of anger, and they're stuffing, they're numbing. So can you give us some insight on like how might you move through anger in a way that's productive and healthy?
Yeah. And I rarely get asked this question, Jess. So I'm excited that I get to share this and talk about this. So I'm thinking of a person who grew up in a family where if they expressed any anger towards their parents, that it would have been shut down. right? Like they would have been annihilated, perhaps. It would have compromised the relationship and thus their survival, because they're a kid and they depend on that relationship to be fed, to be clothed, to be provided.
I think a lot of people grew up in an environment like that.
A lot of people, exactly. And yet we don't recognize that as a trauma. And yet that would have started these trauma patterns being wired into our nervous system where, oh, I can't express that. And I've got to numb that. I've got to turn that inwards in order to save the relationship, even though it's no longer really a true, authentic relationship.
Right.
And so those are the type of people that when grief comes and they reach what would be the normal stage of anger, and any form of anger, their body, their nervous system has decided, no, it is not safe to express anger because that compromises our safety and our survival. And so one of the most effective ways that I have seen working with this is being able to express anger as just a part of us. Because it's much easier for someone coming out of that kind of a history and a childhood to say, there is a part of me that is angry, rather than saying, I am angry. Being able to say, it's a part of me that feels really angry that this person died. A part of me is angry at whoever, God, the universe, the hospitals, the system. It's much easier for them to express it as just a part of them rather than all of me is angry. And it just helps keep it more manageable, because then they can also acknowledge, and there's a part of me that feels sad, and there's a part of me that actually is scared to feel angry. Acknowledging these different parts of us really helps to be able to make that anger phase more manageable and something that we can move through by being able to express it as, it's one part of me that feels quite angry about this.
So if that particular person, maybe that person doesn't have somebody to have that conversation with, because we're all dealing with some form of isolation. And maybe because, families are pulled apart and friendships are pulled apart, maybe this person isn't actually able to verbalize and use that as a tool to say, hey, so-and-so, FYI, a part of me is feeling angry. Are there some good physical outlets, whether it be, art or writing or working out or kickboxing or something that is really supportive to helping people move through, the anger? Maybe it's screaming into your pillow. I don't know, but or going out into the woods and yelling at some trees. But what are some physical outlets if people are really challenged from an isolation standpoint with having, somebody to hold space for them and just dialogue? How else might we be able to appropriately process and transmute these feelings of anger? Because some of them, when you mentioned the system, the powers that be that are creating these scenarios, we're watching collectively, when people bubble up and, come together to share how they feel. It's not always getting them the results that they want. So if we're just talking about how to move through this, how can we physically transmute these strong emotions?
This is awesome, because there is so much that we can do. And it's one of the very misunderstood tools that we can utilize. So many people, including myself, right? We kind of went through different therapeutic processes in our life. And that was what we were told to do, right? Punch your pillow, scream into your pillow.
Boxing,
boxing, exactly. Yeah. Yes. I used to bike, right? That used to be my thing of, anger was not something that I felt comfortable, felt safe expressing. And so I would release it all in these really, really long bike rides. And so, that was my coping mechanism, is over exercising. Yep. Speaking of oxidative stress, right? And
too much cardio for you.
Too much cardio for me, way too much cardio. So that had its own downstream effects on my biology of now I've also got this increased amounts of oxidative stress to deal with. But one of the major tools that we have is, yes, movement, but it's actually a very specific movement. And the movement is very slow and very intentional. And that is what we bring into what I call a somatic practice. And so there are lots of different movements, exercises, things that we can do where we're actually working directly with our nervous system in these trauma patterns. And with anger, especially with anger, being able to slow things down. It's when we are doing things fast that it actually does not allow our body and our nervous system to actually process that and express that. It needs to be when I think of someone, like punching pillows or doing that kind of thing, like it's a very disorganized process. And what the nervous system needs is organized process, an organized movement. And so when people are ready, and sometimes there's a lot of work that needs to be done with developing a somatic practice to even feel safe to do this, to express anger. But once we're ready for that point, then I actually have them take a power type of position with their legs. So it's almost like a mild squat where their legs are fully engaged, but yet it's not like they're super low that they're going to tire themselves out quickly. So I'm thinking of, even some of the yoga poses, like that mountain pose or something like that, where your legs are very engaged. We want muscles engaged.
Okay.
In an organized way. And so I engage their muscles first, make sure that they feel stable in their base.
Okay.
I can't have them feeling unstable in their base. I need them to have their foundation really set into the ground or into the floor or whatever it is, right? And that all happens through their legs and then their hips. And so we play around with it for a little bit until they find just the right place, just the right position, how much weight on each side of their hip, or does it really feel like it is best stable, being perfectly balanced? We play around with that until we find that felt sensation that I have my stable base, meaning someone could come over and push me and I would not fall over. My base is stable and strong. Once we have that, then we bring in some movements with the arms. And oftentimes what I'm starting with is some form of like push away, and whether they want to do a punch or whether they want to do a palm open, I don't think that it matters as much, but the movement pushing something away is very slow. They're not going to be doing fast punches. It's a very slow, like, all right, we're going to take your arm, we're going to pull it all the way back. So there's almost like this, recoil effect as we let it go. And I want them to hold that position until their arm feels so ready to push or punch or whatever it is. And even just doing that, right? Like there's just this whole checking into your body that happens. Whereas when we do these, you're like, okay, just go punch pillows. Then there's no preparation time. It's just this flurry of disorganized, chaotic movement. And so when we do it this way, there's so much intention behind it, which allows us to complete what it is that we need to express. When we do fast, chaotic movement, even though we do it and we may do it until we're tired and exhausted, it doesn't feel complete. It feels complete in that moment because we've reached physical exhaustion, not because our nervous system has actually felt like I communicated what I feel. And so it's this intention behind it, this preparation that allows for that intention. And then when we actually move towards that movement with the legs and the hips engaged, and we are pushing away or punching, and it's in a very slow, methodical way, we reach the very end, we hold it there, and we wait for that signal from our body that says, like, see right there, right? Like I just did it and I got a spontaneous deep breath. That means that movement felt complete for my system, and I can let my arm go now. And now I can just do a recheck-in with my system and my body and see, does it want another one? Or does that really feel complete? And if in all of this conversation around grief, like that's the word that we need to be looking for is, as I'm going through the stages of grief, do I feel like I am completing them, or am I leaving things left undone, unsaid, unresolved that are going to be then stored and stuck in my body that I've got to come back to later? Or as I'm going through this, can I complete this so that I truly am free from the charge, from the energy that happens with this, that comes from the adrenaline, that comes from the cortisol? Those create charges in our nervous system that need to be processed, need to be released for it not to have these lasting effects on our biology.
Okay.
I feel like I've thrown a lot at you.
Yeah, we're gonna have to unpack a little bit of this, and we're just so everyone knows, all of Amy's ways that you can get in touch with her are going to be in our show notes. So if going through a process like this with some professional assistance is of interest to you, please connect with her. Aimie, for the people that might not be willing to explore this at such a deep level, either because of time, resources, interest, things that are distracting them, I'm just curious for kind of like the light version of this. In order to get similar results kind of on your own time, would you recommend exercises that are slower? So like some form of martial arts, whether that be Qigong or Tai Chi, maybe some yoga. Like, are those some exercises that would fall in this category of somatic exercise that might support people doing this kind of naturally without observation or oversight from somebody trained?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So the yes part is that any of these movement-based practices are so helpful for the body. They're just so helpful for the body. The no part of it is that they're not intentional for addressing grief, for addressing anger. And so they're kind of like a placeholder where if you really don't have the time or the interest or the space or the emotional capacity to deal with this right now, it's almost like, well, then do this because it might not progress to things worse. And it might just hold the place until you can deal with this stuff. But when I think of, the movement forms that you mentioned, they're not going to be able to get that completeness sake for grief, for anger, because that's not what they're intended to do.
Right.
And so we do need that element of the nervous system completing something, completing a trauma response. And in order for it to complete a trauma response, it does need to be intentional for that specific trauma response.
So you really need to find somebody who can help you with somatic practice if you want to move through this physically.
Yes. And that's also why I designed my 21-day journey course, because there is so much that we can do for ourselves that actually does not need a therapist, that does not need a professional.
Okay.
I consider these honestly like foundations that I think should be taught to kids in school.
Yeah.
Right. Like these are just like how your nervous system operates 101.
Right.
And this is how, and somehow we've lost this along the way, but this is part of all of the innate wisdom of the body that actually, if we were more in tune with our body, we would be guided to do these things on our own. But since we have so much noise in our environment now, and we've lost so much of this along our way, we never saw our parents doing any form of this. Yeah, we're lost and we have nowhere to start. So let me walk you through my 21-day journey. It's a journey into your nervous system. People describe it as having an intimate experience with your nervous system. And this is what I do. Like, I teach them the very foundational basic skills that they can do on their own. The more advanced stuff, absolutely, go find a professional. But these very basic tools of creating felt senses of safety for yourself, and then support, and then growth and expansion are so entirely possible, even without, a professional background and training and education, for example. And I just think of, I think of my friend. So my friend David, I want to say he was 82. And he came down with COVID after being put into a nursing home for rehabilitation after a stroke just over a year ago. And that's where he got exposed to COVID. And long story short, he was not doing well, and he was not doing well. So I made the decision that I was going to bring him home so that he did not have to die alone. And there was 2 weeks that he was here with me in my home until he did pass away. And that whole experience, Jess, right? Like, you're already starting the grieving process, right? Because you know he's going to pass away. You know he's not going to be there with you. So you're already starting this grieving process. And yet he's still here with me now. His mind was still intact, just his body had absolutely no more energy. And so I'm watching myself going through this experience. And it was so different than other grief experiences that I had been through prior in my life, where before I would have needed to distract myself in those moments where, like we had such an emotional connection. I don't think it's possible to walk through somebody's last final days with them and not have this very strong connection with them. And especially seeing that he was not afraid of dying. And so we were able to have some very open, honest conversations. And in the past, those emotional experiences would have been unmanageable for me, that I would have needed to go clean the house. I would have needed to go do the dishes. I would have needed to go get myself busy to pull away from that and try to keep things manageable. And yet, because of the work that I've been able to do with these types of somatic practices, as well as, of course, helping my biology, I was able to be there for him, with him, the whole entire time, up until, the very last day when he's losing consciousness, and I'm holding his hand as he's losing consciousness, and he's needing me to be there with him. And for me to be able to be there fully emotionally present with him and not need to numb, not need to distract, but be able to have the tools to keep things manageable in that moment. Like, what a gift to myself and what a gift to him. And that's the power of being able to have these tools to move through grief.
I'm really appreciative that you shared that with us, and I'm very sorry about your loss with your dear friend. I understand what you're saying though, and I can definitely relate. About 2.5 years ago, coming up on 3 years soon, probably by the time this gets released, my father passed away in a freak accident. It was the day after his 70th birthday, and he was on a motorcycle, and a deer jumped out, and he died instantly. So that experience completely devastated me, and it transformed my entire life. And I didn't manage it well in the time. However, what I learned so much from it, because while you're going through these really hard experiences in life, there are true treasures available to us through the learning and the transformation process. If you can like embrace it and be willing to like let it transform you and change you. And like, what I got out of it was that I had to stop doing some of the patterns I've been doing my whole life. A lot of that was people pleasing. A lot of that was showing up and serving others, but in the process, I would get harmed or I wouldn't have my needs met. And so there was something about my father leaving the planet that changed the entire way that I view life and how I show up and what I want to be doing. And it impacted relationships. I let a lot of people go where there just wasn't an even exchange of energy. And it transformed my career and what I do and how I show up every single day in the world. And the reason why I reached out to you about having this conversation was just in the past month, I had 2 people who were really important to me leave the planet. They're colleagues, professionals, friends that I work with, and both massive contributors to humanity, massive. And one of them, we had some time to process because he went in for a elective surgery and then got COVID in the hospital. And then, things happened in the hospital that nobody could control. So there was a period of time where I knew it was happening. I was praying like crazy. I was hoping for a different outcome. But within the course of 6 weeks, he transitioned out. And then the other person died suddenly due to age. And it was really interesting to observe myself in going through the different stages and phases. And I'm not through it by any means, because I did, to your point, I caught myself distracting myself and avoiding really looking at it because I had stuff to do, or there was work to be done, or, I had to, show up for other people. And I'm, I haven't figured out like the right time I live in the woods, but I haven't figured out the right time to sit and really be, present with myself in order to honor, acknowledge, these emotions that come up. And, in this weird world that we're living in right now, oftentimes these celebrations of life are getting postponed, maybe sometimes for 6 months or a year. And so a lot of us, I feel, are challenged with feeling kind of stuck because you're not having the opportunity necessarily to go through the stages of kind of honor and reverence for that life in a community setting, because you have to wait. You have to wait till the summer, or you have to wait until some restriction is lifted. And it's really it's a complex situation for all of us to navigate through. And I think the thing that I just really want to express to people is that you're not alone. Like, even if you're suffering in silence, I think that it's important to note that you don't necessarily have to. And there are resources and there are programs. And Aimie and I are talking today because I think she's one of the best leaders on the planet doing this work, which is so important for us today. So anyway, I just really appreciate you being here and sharing your story and your insight and your wisdom with us, because, now is the time for us to learn this information. And, this information about our nervous system, which is not taught in school. Well, the school systems are being upended and upended, and, they're going to transform, because there's a lot of stuff going on in schools that people just don't like and they never signed up for. And it's really great if you're a parent, and you've got a child who's struggling, and that's a whole nother grief issue that we haven't even talked about, is like what's happening to children in trauma, being masked up, not being able to see facial expressions and interpret, properly, like emotions and responses from other people, and what's that doing to their psychology. Like, we don't have time to talk about that today, but I think there's so much value in parents not only doing this work that Amy's talking about for yourself, but learning about it for your children, and how you can integrate that into how your family navigates these challenging times. So thank you, Aimie.
Thank you. And so much of what you said, I think so many people can relate to. And I really want to express that, whatever their coping mechanisms are, they're not bad, and they are the best that they can do at this time. And let's add more tools so that you can do better, right? Tomorrow can be a better day. And one thing, if it's okay, I'll share one more tool that I use in my life, because it's not just, grief is not just the loss of someone to death, for example, but even just changes, right? Like changes in jobs. I recently lost a friendship that was very dear to me. So going through the grieving process of that, right? And so how do you go through the grieving process when you have a lot of stuff to do, right? Like I can't stop everything and be like, nope, I need to grieve this friendship, right? Like, no, you can't. And so what I do and what works for me, hopefully this will be helpful to some in your audience, is that when I sit down to do my work and I feel that I do a quick check-in with my heart, because usually that's where my grief shows up, is in my heart, right? So I do a quick check-in with my heart, and there will often, right, if I'm going through a grieving process, there will often be just a heaviness there, and it can actually hurt, right? There's a pain there. There's a heaviness there. And so I will put my hand over my heart in that moment, and I'll be like, is there anything that you need from me right now to take care of you, to support you while I do my work? And that allows me to not avoid it, not numb it, and not be using my work to distract myself from it. No, I'm holding it. And oftentimes, actually what I have right here is I have a weighted blanket.
Okay.
And sometimes sometimes just putting this on my lap really helps my heart. Sometimes putting it around my neck and it dangles a little bit over my heart. Like little things like this that you wouldn't think make a big difference to my heart that is grieving. It feels like you're listening to me, you're taking care of me. And so I'll be over here and I'll just continue my grieving over here while you do your work, and everybody's good. And it's not that pushing it away and using my work to distract myself from that. I'm actually able to still kind of do this beautiful holding of it while I am doing my work.
That's great. I think pets can, also come into play there. If you don't have the weighted blanket, grab your puppy, grab your cat.
Exactly. They make for great weighted blankets on the lap.
Yeah. I know we've got limited time, but I want to ask you just one more question. I'm kind of curious about what your perspective is. You mentioned the loss of a friendship. I think that, we've all probably gone through some kind of friendship or family turmoil over the last 2 years. And there's just, conflict everywhere. And I'm wondering, what do you think about, what should people do if they know for a fact, hey, I'm stuck and unresolved with my emotions around, this particular relationship. It could use some repair. It could be recovered, but maybe that's not in my best interest at all. But it's undone and it's just kind of out there. So what kind of advice do you have for people who have kind of, I would call it like weird, sticky, like muddy water emotionally, that it's not, and they're not quite sure what to do?
This is huge, because this is often when we make mistakes, that we're doing and saying things in the moment that we feel very strongly about in the moment, feels very true to us in the moment. And then there'll be another moment later on where we're like, oh, that actually wasn't all of me. That was my feeling. That was my emotion at that moment. And now I've made things worse with this friendship. Now I've made things worse with this person. And so when things are muddy, I do kind of going back to that parts work, right? Like I do a lot of parts work, and I identify that there is a part of me that wants to do this. There's a part of me that wants to call them up and chew them out. And there's this other part of me that really wants to reach out and reconnect. And so how do I manage all of these different parts of me? And it really kind of comes back also to this holding of my heart, right? Like I get to hold all of these different parts of me, and they're conflicting desires, because this part wants to do this part over here wants to do that. And yet they're both parts of me and they want very different things. And so being able to recognize as many of these different parts as possible is so helpful, because then I can kind of rise above all of my parts and almost be like my true authentic self, and that wise older part that doesn't do anything, brash. It doesn't do anything reactive. It doesn't do anything underreactive. Like it just is calm, is stable. And given everything going on within myself, let alone the relationship, but just within myself, what is truly my authentic value system here? What is my truth here? And how do I want to show up, not only for myself, but in this relationship, and knowing that can change, right? Like sometimes it's showing up as, because I value you and our friendship, I'm going to express my hurt. I'm going to express my frustration, but how do I want to express that? Right? How do I want to express that to a person that I do care about? Regardless of how things work out, how do I want to be for myself? And being able to, kind of work with all these different parts of us that have all these conflicting things and how they want to do things, and being able to recognize that and then rise above it and almost kind of see them as, all right, these are everything that's going on. And this is who I am. This is what I stand for. And this is who I want to be. And so in this situation right now, this is what that looks like. And sometimes that looks like doing nothing until I just have some space and some clarity too.
That makes sense. I think there's nothing wrong with that. This has been really helpful. I really, appreciate your time and your willingness to share your perspective with us. Aimie, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you? Today is February 18th, and likely this podcast is 18th, 2022, and likely this podcast is gonna be released in March 2022.
Mm-hmm. So they can find me over at traumahealingaccelerated.com. They can also just search for Dr. Aimie and go to draimie.com. That will help them find me. We've got the Biology of Trauma Summit 2.0 and actually have a talk on there on grief as well, and what's behind grief. And that's what this summit is about, is going beyond the diagnosis, beyond the symptom, beyond the condition. And so they can also find me by searching for Biology of Trauma Summit.
When does that launch?
August 8 to 14.
Of 2022? Okay, awesome. And if you're going to search for Dr. Aimie, make sure you spell her name right.
This is true.
It's Aimie, Dr. Aimie. Aimie, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Thank you for the work that you do on the planet. It's a gift to all of us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess.